When he said that, even the sound of cutlery stopped. That phrase echoes in my mind to this day, not because of the words themselves, but because of how they changed everything. By the way, that dinner, which started as a minefield of family tensions, turned into a stage for unexpected justice, and I, the humiliated one of the night, became the center of attention, just not in the way they expected. My name is Camila Rocha. I am 32 years old, have a degree in literature, and work as a librarian at a public school in Houston. Not very glamorous, I know, especially by the standards of my ex-boyfriend's family, or rather my ex-friend Isabella. Yes, because she was the one who invited me to that dinner. And it was also at that dinner that all the layers of our friendship collapsed like a wet house of cards. I've never been the type of person who seeks approval. But for some reason, ever since I got close to Isabella in my sophomore year of college, I felt like I was trying to prove something. Maybe that I was worthy of the space. Maybe that I deserved to be among people who used cutlery I didn't even know how to name and drank wine like they were judging labels. Isabella was charming, but dangerous. And that night, she used every inch of her charm like a blade. The dinner was at her parents' mansion, a house that looked like something out of a magazine, oak-paneled walls, warm lights hanging from crystal chandeliers, a long, elegant table where each place setting seemed calculated like a chess piece. I was there as the childhood friend, although I had the strange feeling that my presence was less a fond memory and more a cruel reminder of the origins Isabella wanted to forget. "Camila, I hope you left your books at home today," she said with a sweet smile. But there was something in her tone, something that the other guests, all equally polished and slightly bored, seemed to pick up on as an invitation to mockery. I laughed, with a lump in my throat. It wasn't the first time Isabella had made comments like that, but that night, with so many strangers around, her words sounded sharper, especially because to her left stood Daniel, the fiancé. Tall, elegant, a renowned lawyer with eyes that scanned the room as if looking for flaws in human contracts. I can't deny it. Daniel intimidated me, but there was something about him, a look that seemed different from the others, less accustomed to laughing at veiled jokes, more attentive to the awkward pauses that follow certain comments. "Do you still live in the same neighborhood?" asked Isabella's mother, with a smile as frozen as the air conditioning that made me shiver. "The one near the train line?" "Yes," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I like it there. It's quiet, and the kids at school love the neighborhood library." The silence that followed was more eloquent than any comment. Everyone continued eating, but I noticed that one or two smiles curled downward as if they had heard something tragic. And Isabella, like a silent conductor, directed everything with little glances, subtly directed toasts and stories that began with, "Remember when," and ended with some embarrassing memory of mine. Little by little, I shrunk inside myself. Each bite seemed to weigh twice as much. The wine no longer went down smoothly, and my breathing became short. But why did I stay? Why didn't I get up and leave? Maybe because I was used to it. Used to putting up with it, to smiling, to not making a scene, to thinking that maybe it was just my imagination. But then, when dessert arrived, a perfectly flambéed crème brûlée, Isabella decided to deliver the final blow. "You know, Danny, I've always admired Camila. She never cared about status, or fashion, or good taste. That's a gift, don't you think?" The laughter was muffled but clear, as if everyone knew there was poison there but considered it harmless. That's when Daniel put his spoon down and said the words that silenced the entire room. But that I'll tell you later. It's funny how people love to talk about childhood friendships as if they were eternal, as if sharing a snack at school automatically guaranteed lifelong loyalty. With Isabella, everything seemed like that at first. Light, sweet, like a friendship from a teen movie. But I learned the hard way that not every story has a happy ending, and that some friendships only look beautiful from a distance. I met Isabella when I was 19 in college. She was studying public relations, but took an elective course on contemporary women's literature, the same one I was taking out of pure passion. She sat next to me in the first class, and with that smile that seemed rehearsed, said, "You seem like the type who reads poetry while it rains. Am I right?" That's how it started. She had this talent for observing others as if it were easy to understand their worlds. And at the time, I felt flattered to be noticed by someone like her. Isabella was the kind of girl who got attention without even trying. Perfect hair, a light laugh, a presence that filled the room. She had friends in every class, moving between different groups like someone changing shoes. And for some reason I never quite understood, she decided to include me in her sparkling world. At first I resisted. We came from different worlds. I took 2 buses to get to college. She came in an imported car with a driver. While I worked part-time at a stationery store to help out at home, she worried about choosing the perfect dress for the party of the week. But she insisted. "You're different, Camila. Other people just repeat cliches. You really think." And that was enough. That one sentence. That validation. Little by little, I began to accept her more. I started spending breaks with her, going to parties, meeting her friends. And also, little by little, I began to doubt myself. At that time, my mother used to say that true friendship doesn't need to prove anything. But with Isabella, I felt like I always had to make up for something, to measure up, to be grateful. And without realizing it, I started shaping my tastes, my mannerisms, my conversations, everything so as not to be the exception among them. I laughed at jokes I didn't find funny. I pretended to understand references I didn't know. I even changed my style. I traded my simple floral dresses for more sober, sophisticated, neutral clothes, as she called them. By the 3rd year, we were inseparable, or so I thought. I traveled with her and her parents to Aspen, the kind of place I only knew from movies. I was her maid of honor at her 21st birthday party, and I helped with the preparations as if she were my own sister. But it was as if I never left the position of guest. I was never an equal. I was the friend she mentioned fondly when she wanted to show how down-to-earth she was. The proof that she was sensitive, empathetic, open. I was an idea, a piece she used to compose her own image. There was a moment, however, when I thought that maybe our friendship was real. When my father was hospitalized after a stroke and my mother had an emotional breakdown, it was Isabella who took me to the hospital. She stayed in the waiting room for hours, held my hand, brought me food. I cried in her lap like a sister. And at that moment, I believed that she saw me for who I really was. But after he passed away, everything changed. She became more distant. She started avoiding my outbursts, changing the subject when I talked about pain. It was subtle at first. "Let's focus on the good things. I don't want to see you sad." Until it turned into, "You're being too intense, Camila. Everything is drama with you now." From that point on, I began to realize that our friendship was not real, and that maybe her affection only blossomed when I was smiling, lighthearted, and fitting perfectly into the mold of the exotic and intelligent friend who doesn't compete for status. Things only got worse when I met a guy named Miguel, an artist with a kind soul and hands that could turn scrap metal into poetry. He and I fell in love quickly, in a beautiful and awkward way. But Isabella, she didn't like it. "You could date someone more stable." "A street artist, Camila?" She never said I wasn't good enough, but she always implied that my tastes and choices weren't up to par, that I could do better. What she really meant was, "You could be more like me." In recent years, our encounters have become rarer. But paradoxically, whenever she needed to show the world that she was still connected to her humble roots, I was called upon. Dinners, parties, social events. I always showed up, almost like a piece of bohemian decor. When she invited me to her engagement dinner, I hesitated. Something inside me already knew it would be a trap disguised as nostalgia. But still, I went. And there, between crystal glasses and rehearsed jokes, all the memories of our friendship came back like a silent movie. And, like an extra in my own life, I watched the whole story repeat itself, until the last scene brought something I never expected. It's curious how exclusion rarely begins with shouting. It comes between the lines, in the looks we exchange, in invitations that were forgotten to be sent, in compliments that carry venom in the undertone of the voice. In Isabella's case, the first cracks began so subtly that it took me years to recognize them. At the time, I called them misunderstandings. Today, I know they were rehearsals for control. Tests to see how far I would allow myself to be diminished without reacting. I remember the first episode clearly. It was during a weekend trip with some of her friends in my last year of college. We had rented a house on a lake, complete with a barbecue, kayaks, and laughter at sunset. I was the only one of the 8 guests who didn't know everyone else. And not by chance, I was also the only one who slept on the couch. "You understand, right, Cammy? I thought you were more down to earth, that you didn't care about beds," said Isabella with a sweet smile, handing me a thin blanket and a pillow that looked more like a folded towel. That weekend, I was included in all the photos, but in none of the important conversations. When they talked about trips abroad, they exchanged glances before continuing. When they told inside jokes, they pretended I would understand with a polite smile. But even so, I stayed. Because part of me still believed that I was being overly sensitive. That true friendship went through moments like this. Then came the symbolic gifts. On her 25th birthday, I bought a rare book of Latin American short stories that I mentioned I had found after weeks of searching. It was a beautiful edition, with a handwritten dedication. Isabella thanked me with a kiss on the cheek, and minutes later, showed off the new designer bag she had gotten from her fiancé, talking about it for 10 minutes straight. I never saw the book again. She said she loved my cultured and simple style. but she also told me to dress up more for certain events. When I started wearing my hair natural, curly, she commented, "Wow, it's bold. Very Camila, daring. But if you want, I have a cream that can help tame it, you know?" That was the first time my chest really tightened, as if part of me was screaming to get out. But the fear of losing her friendship, or confirming that it was never real, still spoke louder. And then came the comparisons. Isabella started bringing other friends around, women who were, in some way, variations of herself. Impeccable clothes, controlled laughter, well-paid professions. She made a point of emphasizing how they were all brilliant, successful, with similar tastes. "But you're different, right, Cammy? I like that about you. You bring a lightness." Lightness. The word followed me like a golden handcuff. To her, light meant, don't compete, don't confront, don't demand. I was the companion who didn't threaten her, who made her look generous, unconstructed, the perfect backdrop for her social narrative. And then, Daniel came along. When I met him at a party at the office where he worked, he seemed different. There was something in his eyes that didn't fit in with the rest of the party, as if he was always observing, questioning. We exchanged a few words, laughed at something Isabella didn't even notice, and for a moment I felt something strange. Belonging. A real connection that didn't pass through the filter of appearances. Isabella noticed. She didn't say anything, but the invitations started to dwindle. The messages got shorter. When I asked about the wedding, she said they were still looking at the list. The following week, she posted a photo with her bridesmaids, and I wasn't in it. That hurt. Not because of the title, but because of the confirmation. I had never been part of it. I had never been considered a central piece. I was the discreet accessory that no longer matched the decor of the new chapter of her life. But the invitation to the engagement dinner arrived a few days later. An unexpected, elegant, formal invitation, handwritten. A letter that seemed to come from an alternate universe where everything was beautiful and civilized. It was her signature, yes, but it was also a trap disguised as nostalgia. "I made sure to invite you, Cammy," she said on the phone. "You've always been there for me, no matter what anyone else says." That phrase echoed deeply. I should have realized that she wasn't including me. She was setting me up, positioning me where she wanted me, as the exception, as the one who doesn't fit in, as the contrasting piece that enhances the rest of the collection. At dinner, her every gesture was rehearsed. Every joke, every shared memory, every biased compliment. She called me sweet and naive, and smiled. She reminded me of when I taught her to live with less, and laughed. She asked me to recite a passage from one of my poems, and at the end, she said it was cute, as if I had done a card trick. And everyone laughed, because everyone understood the subtext, except me for a long time, until it was too late. At that table, my value was a prop. I was the narrative she needed to tell to appear humble, and if I kept quiet, I would continue to serve her purpose. But on that day, something inside me began to crack. The humiliation did not come from a direct attack. It came from the realization that I was not seen, not as a woman, not as a friend, just as a shadow that made her look brighter. And it was in that shadow that her fiancé, Daniel, noticed what no one else seemed to see. But that would come later. On the outside, everything seemed the same. But on the inside, I was no longer the same. Living with Isabella became more tiring than enjoyable, more tense than lighthearted. Still, for some reason that I still can't explain, I kept coming back, accepting invitations, responding to messages, smiling in photos. It was as if I were bound by a promise that was never made, that one day I would be truly seen. But the truth is that I no longer knew where the real Camila ended and where the domesticated version of her began, the one who fit the mold of a versatile, resilient, different friend. Isabella's control was never blatant. It was elegant, wrapped in false compliments and disguised concerns. She began to comment on my clothes more often. "Cammy, that skirt is so comfortable. You should go for pieces that show off your body more." Then came my career. "You're so smart. You could try something more impactful. Are you going to spend the rest of your life in a library?" And then my romantic choices. "Miguel? Oh, he's sweet. But don't you think you're past the phase of experimenting with artists?" All in that same tone, protective, affectionate, but with venom at the base of her voice. And I, trying to keep the peace, ended up accepting suggestions, backing down on ideas, adjusting the way I spoke around her friends. I started to doubt my clothes, my hair, even my opinions. I found myself reviewing sentences in my head before saying anything, not for fear of being wrong, but for fear of being elegantly ridiculed. That feeling of being too much or being too little began to accompany me every time I saw her. The climax of it all came when she started referring to me as the reference in her group. Guys, Camila is the best person for this. She comes from a more simple place. She has a very human view of things. More simple. Those words pierced me like needles covered in cotton, but it was on an autumn afternoon that I realized how much I had silenced myself. Isabella invited me to a gathering of friends in the garden of a bistro. When I got there, I noticed that everyone was perfectly dressed, in silk dresses and high heels. I was wearing a floral blouse and high-waisted jeans. As soon as they saw me, there was a brief silence. One of those silences that lasts seconds but leaves scars for years. Isabella raised her arms and said, "Cammy!" I love that look. So authentic. Guys, that's Cammy. She's essence, not appearance. I smiled, but inside a part of me wilted. I knew what she was doing. She was making me the other, the one who doesn't belong, but serves as a contrast. I was the vibrant color in a beige room, good for the composition, but never for the spotlight. Later that same evening, one of my friends mentioned that she was studying for a diplomatic exam. When I asked her if she was enjoying it, she gave me a condescending look and said, "It's different from your reality, right, Cammy? But it's good. You'd like it." They laughed. Isabella didn't defend me. She just smiled and changed the subject. That's when I understood. It wasn't just Isabella. It was the system she had created. I was the stage prop, an emotional ornament, the friend who makes others look more sophisticated. Over time, my self-esteem began to erode. I started to question everything, from the colors I wore to the way I positioned myself at work. I turned down invitations to literary events because my voice sounded weak to me. I avoided meeting Miguel because I thought he might also be below my potential. Isabella never said that, but she planted seeds, and I watered them. The situation reached a point where even my home seemed inadequate. I started hiding details of my life when I talked to her. I felt ashamed of living with my mother, of riding the subway, of wearing the same clothes over and over again. She said she admired me for being authentic, but she demanded that I wear makeup, sing in tune, and be sharp to live in her world. And I gradually disappeared, like a candle lit in an overly bright room. And then, one day, I cried alone in the bathroom at the school where I work, not because of something someone said to me, but because I couldn't recognize myself anymore, because I missed myself, the girl who read poetry in the rain and felt complete just doing that. The final straw came during dinner week. I got a call from Isabella. "Cammy, you're still coming to dinner, right? It's important to me that you be there. I want everyone to see that our friendship has stood the test of time. You're part of my story." That sentence sounded nice, but it tasted like prison. I knew she didn't want the real Camila. She wanted the decorative, passive, smiling version. That night would be the climax of the performance, the last act of the play. She cast me not as a guest, but as a supporting actress. And I accepted. But something inside me was no longer the same. I might not have been ready to scream, but I was starting to hear my own silence. And at that dinner, it would finally be broken. The worst loneliness is the one we feel when surrounded by people. In the week leading up to dinner, the idea of being back in that circle, of mockery disguised as affection, gave me chills. I slept poorly. I had recurring nightmares with muffled laughter, cutlery clattering on plates, and judgmental eyes fixed on me. But even so, I went. Why? Pride, perhaps. Fear of looking weak. A desire to prove something. I don't even know what anymore. But I went. I chose my dress carefully, something discreet but comfortable. I curled my hair lovingly as a gesture of silent resistance. I took a deep breath before leaving the house, looking at myself in the mirror as if I were a warrior about to go into battle, even though I doubted my own armor. I arrived at the dinner party with a heavy heart and sweaty palms. Isabella's parents' house seemed even bigger at night, all lit up like a movie set. A valet opened the door of the car I had ordered through an app, the first detail that reminded me that I was a stranger there. All the other guests arrived in their own luxury vehicles. Right at the entrance, Isabella greeted me with that theatrical hug and a fake kiss on the cheek. "Camila, I'm so glad you came. I was hoping you wouldn't miss it. You look very Camila today." The compliment felt like a noose. Thin, tight, suffocating. I soon found myself surrounded by people who had already judged me before I even said a word. And that was what hurt the most, knowing that no one there was interested in getting to know me. I was just the eccentric highlight of the night, a subtle reminder that not everyone shines equally, and that some are only there to make others shine. During dinner, I tried to keep my composure. I answered politely, smiled when necessary. But inside, everything was noise, as if I were in a nightmare where every word was a sneaky stab. The comments were not long in coming. Do you still work at that little school? How cute. You must have so much patience. Wow, is your bag crocheted? How vintage. I bet you made it yourself, right? I remember when you said you would never sell out. I'm glad you accept invitations like this now. Every sentence, every dirty look, every muffled laugh, it ate away at me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and say, "You don't know me." But all I did was lower my eyes and drink another glass of wine, a liquid disguise for a broken heart. And then came the most humiliating moment of the night. Isabella, already slightly tipsy, started telling stories from the past. But not just any stories, the worst ones. Those moments that should have been buried in the intimate drawers of friendship. Remember when Camila tried to start a book club at her neighborhood bar? My God, she thought people were going to give up beer to read Clarice Lispector. Ha 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 ha. I went there, guys. There were 3 drunk people and a puppy listening. Everyone laughed. Everyone. I smiled. One of those empty smiles, from someone who no longer knows how to protect their own dignity. But inside, my soul was screaming. It was screaming at me. What are you doing here? I felt small. So small that I felt like I could fit inside my own wine glass. My eyes burned. My body trembled. Not from the cold, but from shame, from helplessness, from realizing that I had allowed this to happen, that I was complicit in my own annihilation. I went to the bathroom to breathe. I locked the door, leaned against the marble sink, and stared at my reflection. My face was beautiful, but lost. My eyes were not the same as they had been years ago. That girl who was in love with words, with poetry, with essence, had disappeared. And in that oppressive silence, in that overly lit bathroom, for the first time in a long time, I cried without hiding. I cried for everything. For the times I kept quiet, for the times I belittled myself, for the times I accepted crumbs of affection, and above all, for not realizing it sooner. It was there, with my makeup running and my heart in pieces, that I felt something different. Not anger, not hurt, but a flame, weak, timid, but steady. The realization that something had to change, that this wasn't friendship, that this was a stage, and I was just a prop for someone who wanted to appear generous, but was cruel. I wiped my face. I looked at myself in the mirror once more, and I swore, silently, that that would be the last time I would let anyone put me in that position. I went back to the living room. Dinner continued as if nothing had happened, but I was no longer the same. I didn't know how yet, but something inside me was in the process of rebuilding, and without realizing it, I was about to witness the moment when everything would fall apart. Not for me, but for her. Because what happened next, no one expected. Least of all, Isabella. You've always been good at keeping quiet, haven't you, Camila? That was the last thing Isabella said before the world around me fell silent. Before Daniel, her fiancé, the man who had been watching everything discreetly, said something that would change the course of that night and, honestly, of my own story. But before I tell you what he said, you need to understand how we got there. I had returned from the bathroom with my face composed but my heart in ruins. My steps were steady, but inside me there was a war going on, between the Camila who had always sought acceptance and the Camila who finally wanted to protect herself. I sat down at the table trying to breathe calmly. The conversation revolved around trips abroad: Greece, the Maldives, Dubai. I had never been to any of those places, and not once did anyone ask me about the trips I took with my mother through the Texas countryside. No one there wanted to hear about roadside cafes or simple lodgings that smelled of wood and fresh cake. The next round of wine arrived. Isabella raised her glass and, with a slightly tipsy look, made a toast. To new beginnings, to old friends, and to the stories that remind us who we are or who we were, right, Cammy? All eyes turned to me. Some laughed. Others just looked away, uncomfortable. But Isabella was having fun. Like a confident actress on stage, she continued, "By the way, I'm going to tell you something that no one here knows. But that perfectly defines our Camila. Perfectly defines our Camila." That was the tone. That need to label me. To encapsulate my essence in a funny anecdote that served her ego. In our first year of college, Camila fell in love with a professor. Yes, guys, a middle-aged professor with dandruff in his suit and everything. She even wrote a poem for him and left it in his briefcase. I saw it with my own eyes. The professor was so embarrassed that he pretended nothing had happened. The table exploded with laughter. And for a moment, I saw myself outside my own body, looking at myself sitting there, motionless, my face burning and my hands shaking under the linen tablecloth. It was a lie, a malicious distortion, but no one cared. The story had a purpose: to ridicule me, to freeze me, to shrink me, and it worked. For a few seconds, I wanted to disappear, to empty myself of flesh, sound, existence. But then, like a silent thunderbolt, the shame gave way to something else. Rage. Not that loud, uncontrolled rage, but the rage of someone who finally understands that they are being used. The rage of someone who wakes up in the middle of a play and realizes that they have always been acting against themselves. Isabella was still laughing, pouring more wine, delighted with her own cruelty. And it was at that moment that Daniel, the groom, slowly put his glass down on the table. The sound of crystal against wood was dry, precise, almost like a dramatic punctuation mark. He wiped his lips with his napkin and, looking directly at Isabella, said, "Do you know what I admire most about Camila?" The table fell silent. Even the cutlery froze in midair. She's the only person here who isn't trying to impress anyone, who doesn't measure her worth by the brand of wine, or the number of followers, or her last name. She's real, authentic, and she has more dignity in her silence than many people here have in all the speeches they've ever made. The air in the room seemed to change temperature. Daniel didn't raise his voice, but his firmness was more cutting than any shout. And honestly, Isabella, if you need to humiliate someone to seem interesting, maybe it's time to take a look at who you really are. There was total silence. Isabella's mother coughed, taken aback. One of her friends pretended to look at his cell phone. Isabella turned pale. Her expression oscillated between surprise, indignation, and something I had never seen in her before. Fear. Fear of being exposed. I couldn't say anything. My eyes were watering, but for the first time, not from pain. It was something else, a kind of liberation. A validation I never asked for, but which came like a door opening in a room where the air had been stale for years. Daniel looked at me, not with pity, but with respect. And that's when I understood. Maybe I didn't need to keep quiet. Maybe I never had to. I got up from the table, without rushing, without shouting. I calmly picked up my bag, looked at Isabella, who now had her eyes fixed on the tablecloth, and said only, "Thanks for dinner," and I left. Each step to the door was like removing invisible shackles that I had been carrying for too long. Outside, the air was cold, but I felt warm inside, not with anger, but with relief. For the first time in years, I was leaving a place without apologizing for existing. On the sidewalk, I took a deep breath and smiled to myself. I didn't know exactly what was coming next, but I knew what I wouldn't accept anymore. And that, for me, was freedom. In the days that followed the dinner, the city seemed the same cars rushing by, the same sounds of trains in the distance, the same faces in the usual cafes. But inside me, something had changed forever. It was as if a room in my soul, previously locked, had finally opened, revealing a forgotten part of me. I was no longer the woman who tiptoed to fit into someone else's life. And for the first time in years, the feeling of being alone was not scary. It was liberating. The following Monday, I returned to work at the library with a different look in my eyes. Not a triumphant look. There was still sadness, insecurity, and exhaustion, but there was also a seed of conviction. I entered that familiar space, and without thinking, took an old burgundy lipstick I hadn't used in a long time from the bottom of my bag. I applied it to my lips as if redrawing my own story. "You look different today, Camila," said the cleaning lady, Donna Lucia, with a knowing smile. "You look like you woke up." I laughed, because that was exactly it. I spent the next few days away from social media. I didn't answer messages. I didn't open any notifications. There was even a message from Isabella, a long one, with an attempt at justification disguised as affection. "Cammy, that dinner got out of hand. You know me, you know I never meant to expose you. People exaggerate. Danny got nervous for no reason. I just wanted to remember the good times. I hope we can talk." I read it, twice, and then I deleted it. No reply. Because now I understood. It's not just about words. It's about actions, about patterns, about years of being molded to fit into spaces that were never meant for me. And I was tired of bending over backwards to please people who didn't care if I broke in the process. That week, I sought refuge in the little things that always made sense to me. I sat in my favorite cafe with a notebook and wrote. I wrote like I did when I started college, uncensored, without thinking about aesthetics, just raw emotion. I went to a small bookstore downtown and bought 2 books of contemporary poetry. I went back to listening to songs that had my voice, my story. I rediscovered the beauty of being in my own company. I also saw Miguel again. Yes, that artist with paint-stained hands and eyes that read silences. We met without haste, like people relearning how to walk on solid ground. I told him what had happened. He listened in silence, his eyes attentive and full of tenderness. "You spent so long trying to mold yourself that you forgot you were already amazing before all this," he said, holding my hand firmly. These words did not come from a place of empty romanticism. They came from someone who saw me before the mask. Someone who loved me for who I was, not for what I could represent. That same night, I decided to do some symbolic cleaning. I went back home and in silence picked up a box. Inside, I placed all the memories that connected my story to Isabella's. Old photos, party souvenirs, handwritten cards, even a shirt she had given me that I always wore out of aesthetic obligation. I closed the box and stored it on top of the closet, as if to say to myself, this existed, but it no longer defines who you are. After that, I sat on the living room floor with a cup of hot tea and started a list. A simple but profound list. Things I gave up to be accepted. And there I wrote, my style, my natural hair, my original poems, my spontaneity, my voice in debates, my courage to confront, my true lightness. I cried as I wrote, not out of pain, but out of relief. That list was my starting point, the first brick in rebuilding my life. I also went back to therapy, which I had abandoned due to lack of time or fear of what I would hear. I told her everything. The therapist, in silence, just said to me at the end of the session, you weren't weak, Camila. You were conditioned, but now you're rewriting the script. And that's an act of courage. Yes, that was exactly what I was doing. And then something unexpected happened. I received a call from a professor at the university where I graduated. There was going to be an event on peripheral literature and social transformation, and she wanted me to participate as a guest speaker. She said she remembered the book club I had created years ago, the one Isabella had ridiculed, and that she had been inspired by the impact it had made, however small. I swallowed hard. You want me to speak? I asked, surprised. Yes. Your story matters, Camila, and a lot of people need to hear it. That proposal wasn't just an opportunity. It was a sign that I was back, that my voice, the one they had always tried to silence, was being reborn, with more strength, more truth, more self-love. And so, with still timid but increasingly firm steps, I began to prepare for the moment when I would no longer be a supporting actress. I would finally take on the leading role in my own story. 2 weeks after dinner, Isabella showed up at my door. No warning, no message, no preparation. I saw her through the peephole holding a bag with cheese bread and artisanal coffee, the same ones she used to bring in college when we still pretended we were soul sisters. I opened the door, not out of nostalgia, not out of weakness. I opened it because I needed to finish what I had started. Cammy, can I come in? She said, her voice sweet, her smile rehearsed, her eyes unsure whether to ask for forgiveness or control. I nodded and let her in. She looked around as if she were revisiting an old place, but at the same time, uncomfortable, as if the atmosphere was no longer favorable to her. We sat in silence for a few minutes. She opened the bag, put the bread on the table, and offered me a cup. You still like coffee without sugar, right? I didn't answer. I just looked at her, and she understood that the Camila in front of her was no longer the same. I wanted to apologize, sincerely, for dinner, for what I said. For the way everything happened, she began, her tone somewhere between guilt and justification. I got carried away. I was happy, nervous. Sometimes I talk too much and you belittle others. I finished calmly but firmly. She froze. She looked at me as if she hadn't expected resistance, as if she had expected the Camila she always knew, the one who smiles, who lets things go, who protects others from their own guilt. But that Camila stayed at dinner. I never meant to hurt you, Cammy, she said, her voice now higher as if seeking compassion. But you did, I replied. And it wasn't just at dinner. It was years, Isabella. Years in which I was the exception, the simple friend, the exotic highlight. You put me in that role, and I accepted it. But now, I don't accept it anymore. She looked away. She tried to smile. You've always had this dramatic side, she said, trying to soften the blow. And you've always had this cruel side disguised as charm. Silence. It was the first time I had seen her without control of the situation, without the script. And for the first time, I saw an insecure woman, knocked off the pedestal she had always placed herself on. She tried to change the subject, as she always did. Danny, he also overreacted. He shouldn't have said it like that. But you know how he is. Too sensitive. No, Isabella, I interrupted. He didn't overreact. He said what everyone should have said years ago. She bit her lip. She put her hand on the bag, as if wanting to cling to any symbol of familiarity. I just want things to go back to the way they were. But I don't. And to be honest, I didn't even want them to be that way. She seemed to wilt. Her shoulders slumped. Her posture collapsed. So that's it? She asked. Yes. This is my life coming back to me. This is me looking in the mirror and finally liking what I see, without needing your validation. She took a deep breath, as if swallowing something she wasn't ready to digest. You've changed. I've found myself. We were silent for a few seconds. She stood up as if waiting for a hug, a truce. But I didn't get up. I just looked at her and said, I don't wish you any harm, Isabella. But from now on, I'm putting myself first. And in that place, there's no room for you anymore. She nodded, almost with tears in her eyes. For the first time, I realized that maybe she was reaping the consequences of a life built on top of others. She left without saying another word. I closed the door and didn't cry. I didn't feel light or euphoric. I felt at peace. There, in that simple room, with the smell of warm coffee and books piled in the corner, I understood that true power does not lie in shouting louder, but in knowing exactly when to say, enough. There was no applause. There were no witnesses, but there was liberation, and that is worth more than any apology. Today, when I look back, I no longer feel ashamed. I feel gratitude. Gratitude for having gone through all that and still not losing myself completely, for having resisted, even if silently, for years, and for, at the most unlikely moment, finding my voice again, the one that so many tried to silence with fake compliments, polished irony, and overly tight hugs. Rebuilding yourself is not easy. It hurts. It's like learning to walk again after wearing tight shoes for too long. At first, everything seems strange. You ask yourself, is this really me? But then comes freedom. And it is beautiful. Over time, I filled my life with new colors, new people, new spaces. Miguel and I are still together. Not because we need each other, but because we chose to walk side by side. Respect, lightness, and truth. Neither of us tries to fit into molds. We just are. At the library, I proposed a community literature project and got it approved. Now, teenagers from the neighborhood, many of them discredited by society, write their own stories, their own poems, their own cries. I listen to them with the care I wish they had given me when I was just a young dreamer trying to fit into someone else's world. The event at the university took place. I stepped onto the stage with my heart racing, my hands shaking, and my head held high. I told my story. I spoke of silent exclusions, toxic friendships, and the importance of recognizing when something stops being love and becomes a prison. At the end, a girl in the audience hugged me, crying, and said, "You told my story without knowing me." And it was in that hug that I understood. The pain I had silenced for so long was now turning into healing, not just for me, but for others. Today, I have fewer friends and more genuine connections. I get fewer invitations to fancy dinners and more coffees with people who laugh for real. I feel less need to prove anything, and more pleasure in simply existing. And what about Isabella? She tried to get back in touch one more time. She sent me a short message saying she missed me. I read it. I took a deep breath, and I left it there, like so many other things that no longer belong to me. Because there are stories that, in order to move on, we need to accept that they don't deserve a sequel. We grow up hearing that some people will be in our lives forever, but the truth is that some exist only to teach us what we will never accept again. Isabella was that for me. A mirror of what I don't want to be. A warning of what happens when we stray too far from who we are just to fit into spaces where we were never invited, only tolerated. If I could talk to the 5-year-old Camila who dressed insecurely and spoke afraid of sounding naive, I would say, you don't have to prove yourself to anyone. Your essence is your value, your voice, your beauty. Don't accept emotional crumbs from those who only feed off your silence. And to you who have come this far listening to me, perhaps in silence too, perhaps recognizing yourself in me, I say, don't wait for the spark. Don't wait for dinner. Don't wait for someone to save you from humiliation. You don't need a stage to exist. You are enough. You are strong. You are living history. And you deserve a lifetime of tables where you can sit with dignity and never be the main course of someone else's cruelty.